Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, Secretary General of the United Nations, Heads of Delegation, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and privilege to address you on behalf of President Captain
Palestine and the question of Palestinian state.
The cameras roll, the flags wave, the world pretends to listen. But this year, something different happened, something no one expected. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, refused to speak. He rejected the stage. He rejected the insult. He rejected the empty chairs that have always greeted African leaders. And his words shook not just Africa, but the entire world. When the leaders of the West address the General Assembly, the hall is full, every seat occupied. Heads of state lean forward to listen. Applause rings out after every sentence. But when African leaders take the same podium, the scene changes. The hall is nearly empty. Delegates walk out. Heads are turned away. The voice of Africa echoes into silence.
Creemos que el camino hacia la universidad.
All right. Welcome to This Week in Africa. Sorry for the delay today and some technical difficulties, but we are here to talk about this week's news. And as you see, we're going to talk about Traoré rejecting the UN invite and his controversial speech, African leaders scolding empty seats at the United Nations General Assembly, and other stories from around the continent. But before we get into the live stream, let's do a quick introduction to who we are and what we do. So This Week in Africa is a weekly live stream and collaboration between Authentic African Media Group and the Gloria Ayo. Each week, we break down the news of the day as it pertains to Africa and seeing Africa get back to its rightful place on the world stage. Now, before we get into today's stories, let's do quick introductions. I'll turn it over to my co-host before I introduce myself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gloria Ayo. I am host, creator, founder of The African Story. And as always, I'm happy to be here. Hi, Joe.
Hey. And I am Joe Hatagwa, the founder of Authentic African Media Group and Authentic African e-commerce site sourcing products made on the continent, ethically sourced and handmade for people who want to support African artisans living in the diaspora. I also built out the Authentic African platform with 3 goals: get people to visit, move, or invest in the continent of Africa. I was just there for the last 3 weeks, just got back this past Sunday, and I spent a significant amount of time shooting content that I look forward to be sharing with you all. So this week, we weren't here last week. Gloria was on vacation, much needed vacation, and we were not able to go live. So we want to tell you the stories that happened while she was away, while I was in Ghana, and some of the updates that have been happening over the last week as well. So lots to cover today, and we look forward to sharing it with you all. So with that, let's get into the first story. So the first story is Captain Ibrahim Traoré rejected the UN General Assembly and had his own press conference where he vowed to win the war against armed groups and reclaim control of the economy. He had a 90-minute press conference making marking the 3rd anniversary of his leadership. He described inheriting an army in 2022 with barely 100 rifles and fewer than 100,000 Kalashnikov rounds. These are Russian arms rounds. He said some soldiers were even sent to the front without weapons. So he announced a 3rd phase of the conflict with plans to manufacture arms domestically while accusing foreign powers of recruiting mercenaries and trying to encircle the Sahel region through bases in countries such as Cote d'Ivoire. He also said on the economy that the state has bought back 2 gold mines and signaled moves to reclaim strategic sectors from private hands. He denounced what he called savage capitalism, arguing that profits must serve Burkina directly. Asked about Palestine, Traoré replied that Africa also faces urgent crises in Sudan and the Democratic Republic. Still, he reiterated support for Palestine, saying it must be recognized as a state. Now, that particular statement focusing on Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo will be the theme of today's discussion as we listen to what some of the other leaders had to say during the UN General Assembly. But before we get into that, let's hear what Ibrahim Traoré had to say in his 90-minute press conference, and we'll have some commentary on the other side. I will pull up the video here in just one moment. Here we go. I think this is it. Okay, here we go.
Que nos pays n'ont pas besoin d'être militarisés. C'est leur conception. Nous sommes comme des enfants, c'est eux qui doivent venir s'asseoir, faire la sécurité pour nous. C'est un État. Pourquoi on ne va pas reconnaître un État palestinien? Ce qui se passe, c'est très grave. Je pense que l'État palestinien existe et doit exister. Sinon, cette guerre ne finira jamais. Le capitalisme ne peut qu'être sauvage. Si vous laissez le capitalisme se développer à un certain niveau, finalement, vous allez vous perdre. Il faut essayer au maximum de mettre les gens à un certain niveau. Tant qu'il y a la richesse, que ce soit bien réparti. Nous avions une...
We have an ideology that we began to implement, revolution. I think that when you decide to start a revolution, you have to get ready for it. It's logical that they surround us in the fight for the foreign interest, and it's up to us, if we decided to do a revolution, to do everything possible to ensure that this encirclement is not something that takes over, right? Basically, he had a lot to say. I realize that this is all in French, so it'll be hard to kind of keep up and read it all. So I think you guys got the point. If you want to watch the interview and the conference or in the press conference, you can check out the video on in the description of this video. So with that, let's get right into commentary on him missing the United Nations, even though he did have a representative there who did address the UN. What were your thoughts on his 90-minute press conference and all the things that he covered in that press conference, and missing the United Nations and a chance to speak there as well?
Yeah, so regarding the conference, I mean, this is just basically a way to, and this is what leaders do, obviously, which makes a whole lot of sense. Basically, a way to let you know, hey, we're reasserting authority or letting you know what really is going on. And of course, as we know, Traoré has gone against things that are not favorable to his people, even if it means not aligning with the West. So the speech, basically is him just talking about their plan, or him using the opportunity to reiterate his stance as far as having Burkina Faso completely independent of Western influence. Because at the end of the day, if some external actor is controlling your economy, you don't have any sovereignty. So this is his way of making it known that domestically, Burkina Faso is doing what it can to ensure that its grip is tightened, and really that Burkina Faso is not to be played with. Now, as far as his silence on the world stage, some might see it as a snub of Western-led international forums. But whether this is real or speculative, we cannot deny the symbolic impact. Burkina Faso under Traoré is not afraid to break diplomatic convention because they prioritize their sovereignty. So the alliance, the AES alliance, I mean, was always created anyway as a rejection of what these countries see as decades of neo-colonial interference and any sort of moral lecturing from the West. So the silence at the UN is in line with what African leaders have done in the past, you know, being absent from international conventions, basically to send a message. Kwame Nkrumah once walked out of a meeting with Western diplomats after accusing them of undermining Pan-Africanism. Idi Amin once boycotted a British Commonwealth summit after being criticized over human rights abuses. Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe he rarely applied at UN conferences because that was his way of accusing the West of economic sabotage. You know, but in Traoré's case, he didn't even show up at all, which might actually even be louder than words. But, you know, as we know, what we know for a fact is that Burkina Faso has increasingly withdrawn from international visibility. And I mean, they've even declined press interviews. They've limited foreign NGA operations. They're more focused on strengthening, if they're going to have, you know, external forces involved, they're more interested in alternative global powers such as Russia.
Yeah, all good points. And I'll just say, you know, one of the things that, you know, we were researching this in the other day when we were talking about these stories. You know, you basically ask to be able to speak, and they give you the ability to speak, right?
Yes.
And you know, one of the things that we noticed, or that comes up all the time when it comes to the UN, is that African leaders almost always speak to empty seats. Last year at the UN General Assembly, the year before at the UN General Assembly, we were live, and we discussed this. I was live with African Stream at the time, and we discussed that the UN General Assembly last year had the same thing. African leaders speak, and nobody's there to listen to them. Like, the only reason why we even know that that these speeches were done is because the UN has a YouTube page, and they actually post the speeches, but nobody else heard those speeches. So, you know, there was a viral moment that you guys all might remember last week where many delegates walked out on Israel when Benjamin Netanyahu got up and spoke, and it was meant to be a symbol of, you know, the idea that they were breaking ties with what Israel was doing in Palestine, right? And so many people reposted that. It went viral. What you guys don't know, though, is that happens prior to when African leaders speak. So they're not doing it in defiance of those African leaders. They're just disinterested, right? So they don't even show up for those speeches, or they do leave during those speeches. Maybe not a mass exodus to disrespect them, but there already is no respect by not sitting through those speeches in the first place. And so, although all these African leaders were grandstanding, had a lot to say, it basically fell on deaf ears, and the only people listening to them were the other African leaders who also were waiting for their turn to speak, right? And so I do think you have to keep that in mind when it comes to the United Nations. You know, many of these leaders were speaking about making sure that we had a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera. But you also have to understand that none of these folks were even listening to what they had to say. I do want to get into a little bit about what was discussed, and then I will play a video for you all that kind of speaks to what they focused on. So many of the African leaders at the United Nations focused their speeches on calls for systemic UN reforms, especially demanding a permanent African representation on the Security Council. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but I do know that every once in a while, like, African countries get to come in and out of the Security Council, but they don't have permanent representation on the Security Council. If I'm not mistaken, Sierra Leone is actually on the Security Council for a particular term, but there isn't permanent representation on the Security Council. Greater global equity, meaning what that means, right? You guys understand what that means. And justice for international affairs. They also emphasize economic sovereignty, actions on trade barriers, comprehensive development, and the defense of Palestine statehood, which was something that came up as almost universal amongst all of the African leaders. And then, of course, rights and broader global conflicts. So, however, despite severe ongoing humanitarian crises in countries like Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo, in-depth discussion or advocacy for solutions concerning wars and conflicts within Africa itself was largely absent from their remarks. So, again, key African leaders discussed UN Security Council reform. Multiple leaders demanded that Africa be granted at least 2 permanent seats with veto power and non-permanent seats to address the imbalance of power in global governance and better represent African interests. They also asked for equitable global order, meaning across those speeches, they were repeated demands for fairness and justice in international relations, responses to climate change, and an end to persistent economic disadvantages faced by African nations. Of course, support of Palestine came up unilaterally with almost all of them. African leaders, including Nigeria's vice president and Senegal's president, spoke out strongly against Israel's actions in Gaza and called for the legitimate right of Palestinians to be respected in accordance with international law. What was missed was discussion of African wars. There was minimal focus on home conflicts. Analysts point out that African leaders, while vocal on international crises, particularly Gaza, gave only brief references to ongoing wars within Africa. The conflicts in Sudan and the DRC, both resulting in thousands of loss of life and humanitarian disasters, were not substantially addressed or advocated during the UNGA speeches. Missed humanitarian crisis advocacies, limited mentions of Sudan and the Congo represented, according to many security analysts, a significant missed opportunity to draw global attention to seek solutions for Africa's most urgent crises. Institutional leadership gaps, the absence of detailed discussion about African conflicts is seen as a reflective of a broader institutional weakness within African multilateral organizations and lack of African leadership at key negotiating tables with external powers, often leading peace efforts for these crises outside of the continent and not with African leaders. And in complex geopolitical involvement. So really, there was a lot to say about what happened outside of the continent, but not enough to say about what happened on the continent. I'm going to play a quick video that's like a quick, brief clips from a few different African leaders and what they focused on. And then we will have some commentary on the other side.
The people of Palestine are not collateral damage in a civilization searching for order. They are human beings, equal in worth, entitled to the same freedoms and dignities that the rest of us take for granted.
Au Moyen-Orient, le peuple palestinien continue de vivre la pire des calamités que les mots ne peuvent plus exprimer. Sous le fracas quotidien des bombes, toutes les limites ont été dépassées. Nous ne pouvons ni nous taire, ni détourner notre regard, car Gaza ne vit plus. Gaza, terre de larmes, de sang et de sueur, est devenu un enfer pour des millions d'âmes de tous âges, piégées dans une prison à ciel ouvert. Hommes, femmes et enfants agonisent tous les jours, privés de nourriture, d'eau et de soins de santé. Le Sénégal réitère sa ferme condamnation de cette tragédie que rien ne saurait justifier.
Madam President, the UN Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestine territory, including Israel, Eastern Jerusalem, has just released its findings that indeed a genocide is being committed against the Palestine people. Despite the clear provision of the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and advisory opinion rendered by the international community of justice, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is worsening and access to humanitarian aid is severely limited. A failure to address the crisis in Gaza could become the moral failure that define this era.
All right, so back to this topic here. So Gloria, what are your thoughts on the heavy focus on what is happening in Israel and Palestine and the missed opportunity to discuss DRC, Sudan, and many of the other challenges facing the continent of Africa?
Yeah, I mean, these are undoubtedly important issues, and they do affect African nations to an extent. But we can all see the near absence of strong, urgent languages around Africa's issues. We have ongoing internal crises. I mean, we have literally a war going on in Sudan. There's an escalating conflict in Eastern DRC. These have caused some of the largest displacements, and obviously a whole lot of loss of lives. And nobody thought it fit to actually hammer on the crisis going on in these places. I don't understand it. The war in Sudan alone has displaced over 7 million people. The DRC, I mean, people are facing ongoing violence from militia. We're having loss of lives. We're having essays, exploitation of natural resources, and that's not urgent. The Sahel, where thousands have lost their lives due to terrorism and displacement, nobody's talking about that. And this might explain Traoré's silence. Perhaps he realizes that the UN no longer offers solutions. It feels like all we do is talk. So if they're not getting these emergencies, if they're not centering them on such a high-profile stage, Africa risks reinforcing that global perception that what's going on in our crises are politically inconvenient, even to our own leaders.
Yep.
So basically now we're seeing where leaders are prioritizing, it feels like they're prioritizing external validation over the crisis going on the continent. It's so disappointing. What's going on in Gaza is important. What's going on in Africa is extremely important too. And if they don't speak up for us, who will?
100%. And, I do think it was a missed opportunity. There will be enough people talking about what's happening in Palestine. And so, and I do think, as you said, I think it's important to take a stance as a leader and to talk about these things. But again, what's happening on the continent of Africa has had as great of an impact on African people as what's happening in Palestine is having on Palestinian people. And it is important to talk about all things. I think leaders in the past have done a great job of doing that. When you think about many former African leaders, they did talk about the fact that, a free Palestine is on par with the free Africa, right? And many people talked about things in that way. But there was two conversations happening, right? And I think, look, it's great for PR if you want to get that soundbite and you want your speech to go viral, to talk about the thing that everyone is talking about. But I think it would have been a great opportunity to then pivot from that discussion to how there are other lives being displaced on the continent. Many hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost in the 2.5-year span in Palestine. So to be clear, we are all very aware of that, and that is not okay. However, I think it's also important, and I see that my video is frozen. It is also important to mention that the same is true for multiple countries on the continent of Africa. Many hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, and many hundreds of thousands, and millions of people have been displaced. The numbers are on par, maybe even larger on the continent, in many cases larger, in similar timeframes, right? And so I do think it's important that we do call these things out and look for solutions. And the other piece to this, I think, that was really important is, the idea that Africans get up and speak to a group that don't really listen to them, right, does lead most people to believe that what this assembly is meant to do is just to have like a TED talk. You know, it's not really meant to actually come up with solutions. It's just meant to give a speech for social media, you know, stuff that you could use for later. That's how people feel when they watch these speeches. Mostly nothing comes out of these conversations on stage, like in terms of ways to fix what is happening. So if you're going to draw a spotlight at least to injustices happening in the world, you should be drawing a spotlight to what is happening in your own backyard. And I think we both agree on that. And I think that many who are watching feel the same way. I think to further that point, and to the point that I made earlier about leaders in the past, there's a ton of videos right now talking about what the African leaders were focused on, and what it speaks to many. This video that we're going to play now, what it speaks to is the fact that most people are focused on how African leaders have focused on what's happening in Palestine, and in Israel, and does not speak to anything happening on the continent. So I want to play this video, a portion of this video, because it is pretty long. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this video as we watch it, and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Palestine and the question of Palestinian statehood is front and center at this year's UN General Assembly. But across the African continent, only 2 countries have not officially recognized the state of Palestine: Cameroon and Eritrea. By the late 80s, after Yasser Arafat's declaration of independence in Algiers, most African states had recognized Palestine. Leaders like Thomas Sankara and Nelson Mandela even linked the Palestinian struggle to Africa's own liberation fights. But Cameroon and Eritrea stayed on the sidelines. Cameroon doesn't have any diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority and rarely speaks about the issue at all. On the contrary, it is heavily involved with Israel.
Israel sees Cameroon as one of its strongest allies.
So I'm not going to play this whole video, but you guys can see the theme of this video. It speaks to how African leaders have focused outside of Africa and who has sided with Palestine and who hasn't. Again, an important topic in general, but what most of these videos don't do is focus on how African leaders have talked about what's happening in Africa, right? We should be seeing videos like this about how Cameroon, Eritrea, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, how they're responding to what's happening in the DRC and Sudan. Now, you know, obviously, as I mentioned, and what we saw in that earlier video, Ibrahim Traoré, during his speech, he was asked about Palestine, and what he did was he pivoted right back to what's happening on the continent. And that is how you control the narrative. And it is important that we focus on issues at home, you know, because these are countries, many of these countries are not that far away from the conflicts that are happening. And what you don't find is many countries who neighbor these countries even talking about these things in a public format where they should be. And so I just wanted to play that video because you see the focus was not on African problems, but how African leaders were focused on problems that are happening outside the continent. Any thoughts on this video or what was mentioned here, and any additional thoughts? I know we talked a lot about this, but I don't know if you have anything else about this particular video.
Yeah, I mean, Cameroon and Eritrea choosing not to align. And I'm glad you pointed that out, that Traoré first talked about how African crises are not talked about enough before he now gave his opinion on the situation in Gaza. That's exactly what we expect. We're not saying don't talk about these issues, but we have more urgent needs. For instance, the vice president of Nigeria, sorry to digress real quick. The vice president of Nigeria, Shatima, is talking so passionately about Palestine, but we have a crisis in Nigeria with the terrorism going on. it's become such an issue that it's even gone on to, I mean, now you have people from the West actually concluding that that is some kind of religious thing going on. That's religious terrorism. Of course, people have fought back and said, no, Muslims are also affected. We know right now Nigeria is a Muslim state. So, and you know, this is why when people say in the interest of sensibilities, you know, things have to be balanced. But I get, you know, you prioritizing what's going on in Palestine, but we have crises going on in Nigeria, literally as we speak. And that would have been a great opportunity to address that as well. But back to Cameroon and Eritrea, I mean, this was a political move. Cameroon and Eritrea have, I mean, Ethiopia, when Ethiopia had its crisis, I mean, I think that was mentioned in that video, Palestine showed support to Ethiopia, and Eritrea saw that as a message, and now Eritrea has since aligned with Israel. And Cameroon is, I mean, these two countries are clearly outliers as far as African diplomacy is concerned, is at least as it relates to what's going on in Gaza, but it's strategic. They're basically just choosing who they align with. That's all that is. Yeah,
yeah. And I think that the idea is that, the phrase is, we know where their bread is buttered, right? And so, that is why they made those alliances. But again, Africa should be the focus of these leaders. And, I think we hope to see that, that it does continue to improve with people like Ibrahim Traoré leading the way. So now, moving on to other stories from around the continent. I think next we can talk about Madagascar dissolving its government after deadly youth protests. So just a little bit of context for what's been happening if you guys aren't aware. Massive anti-government protests have engulfed Madagascar, with young people leading demonstrations in the capital over persistent water and power cuts. The unrest, which began last Thursday, turned violent over the weekend, with clashes between protesters and security forces, reports of looting and property damage. At least 5 people have reportedly lost life, though official figures remain unconfirmed. Demonstrators, many wearing masks and symbolic straw hats, blocked roads and demanded action from the government. The president sacked the emergency minister and condemned the violence, but protesters said that was insufficient. The crisis highlights the island nation's infrastructure challenges and growing public frustration. I'll also mention that the president was forced to dissolve the government following those protests, and at least the number has gone up to 22 people who have lost life and hundreds were injured. So we're going to play a bit from this video, and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Jack Dorsey's decentralized messaging app BitChat has seen a massive spike in downloads from Madagascar as violent protests over chronic power and water shortages grip the African island nation. The surge marks the 3rd time in September that civil unrest has driven protesters towards offline communication tools. Demonstrations began on September 25th this year, when hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Antananarivo, Madagascar's capital. The catalyst was simple but devastating. Residents were fed up with power cuts lasting more than 12 hours each day.
Madagascar descended into chaos on September 25th over repeated water and electricity outages, with police firing tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters in the capital Antananarivo, which spiraled into chaos with looting and arson. Police patrolled the capital in large numbers, from early morning after authorities banned the demonstration the day before. Citing the risk of public disorder. But the protesters defied the call and tried to break through a police barricade to reach their planned meeting point in the Ambohijatovo district in central Antananarivo. Madagascar's president sacked his energy minister in a bid to calm protesters, which had left wreckage strewn across the capital a day earlier. Protesters have voiced anger over persistent water and power cuts that often leave homes and businesses without electricity for more than 12 hours each day.
We can play, you guys can watch the rest of the video at home. This is at least a 5-minute video, so we won't have the time to go through the full video. But your thoughts on the energy minister being sacked, the government being dissolved, is that enough? And what are your thoughts here on the protest itself?
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to talk about the Morocco protest as well, but I mean, I think it was in Madagascar, huh?
Yes, we will.
Yeah, not to preempt, sorry. But I think it was in Madagascar where they said, no, at this point, we want the president out. That's exactly what happened in Nepal. And this was why I did a video when I talked about, on my platform, when I talked about why Africans are supporting Nepal. This is actually the evidence of Africans supporting Nepal. And Kenya, of course, we have to talk about Kenya again, because as it relates to this tag of Gen Z protests, man, Kenya, ooh, just look at the impact, right? So Nepal does its thing recently and they succeed. The prime minister leaves. So Madagascar, of course, and this is it usually only takes one thing to trigger a mass protest. In Nigeria, when NSARS happened, it was based on police brutality. And then people said, you know what? It goes beyond police brutality. We want this fixed. There was a list. This is what's going on in Madagascar now. They're talking about electricity. I mean, I'm sure, I hate to bring Nigeria into this, but I'm sure countries like Nigeria are like, y'all protesting over not having light for 12 hours a day? What? Do you know what I mean? So, and that happens in South Africa when there's usually issues with power. You see people, having strong reactions. So I'm sure Nigerians are like, what? We've protested for things that are far worse than this, the few times, I don't want to say the few times, so I don't seem like I'm minimizing, the protests we've had in the past. But some Nigerians will tell you, we don't come out as we should. And this is not me trying to suggest anything, but I stand with the people of Madagascar who are standing on business and requesting that which is their right. It's not a privilege. This is their right. I stand with you, Madagascar. I stand with any country that speaks against things that, you're taking from the people's commonwealth. This is the country where people, the citizens have suffered decades of extreme poverty, weak infrastructure. There's a high corruption rate, frequent breakdowns in public service delivery, and we want them to be quiet. You can only push the people so far. And for it to be the Gen Z generation doing this, hats off. You go, Madagascar. Are you on mute? Oh, looks like we lost Joe. But yeah, we stand with the people of Madagascar. We stand with the people of Morocco. If you don't treat the people well, whether or not it's you're being corrupt, whatever the case is, the people will stand on business. And I'm hoping some kind of wave happens throughout Africa. See, I will be out there line, believe it or not. I am for it, Joe. I am here for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, civil disobedience, I think does lead to political change, right? I think the idea of, getting out and protesting and drawing attention, generally brings shame and does cause change. I do think It is really, 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 really important that we follow what's happening on the continent. You know, there were times when we talked about the Arab Spring, when there were other protests happening in the different Arab countries around the world, and they were protesting change or protesting status quo and looking for change. And as you said, on the continent of Africa, I think Kenya really did start, was a big start to this new wave of protests. But shout out to the folks who protested in Nigeria for the End SARS movement, you know, and of course that ended up in loss of life, unfortunately, back in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. It was, 2020. And, you know, and we've seen protests all around the continent. You know, in the United States, I think we get the benefit of the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, right? And that is something that many people in the United States take for granted. Around the continent, not every constitution has these amendments or elements to their constitution that allow for these things. And so many times they're met with military force or political force or police force. And so these are really, really brave individuals who are, you know, speaking up for their beliefs and looking for change. And what we're seeing is some change is happening. Look, you know, Ruto last year fired his entire cabinet, right? He did not step down, which is what they were asking for. At the very least, there was some change, some, I would say, adjustments made. And so you can see that these protests do encourage change and adjustments. You know, full-scale change will have to be done at the ballot box in countries that actually have free and fair elections. Otherwise, you know, I think the continued protests will be useful. And so I encourage people to do it safely and civilly, you know, because at the end of the day, destroying your own country folks' businesses is not useful to any cause, right? And so I do want to call that out, that, you know, and it may not even be the protesters. A lot of times those are agitators and folks who are on the side of the government, a lot of times hired to do those kinds of things. But in any case, I think to, you know, just let's try not to be disruptive to the cause. So on a similar note, there were other protests in Morocco that you just mentioned, and I do want to get to the protests in Morocco. And so for a little bit of context, Gen Z protests, corruption accusations ignite protests in Morocco, and we also talked about in Madagascar, of course. Violent clashes has erupted between protesters and security forces in Morocco. Youth-led demonstrations continued for at least 4 days. Hundreds marched through the streets of Morocco on Tuesday night, demanding better social services and less corruption. So let me go ahead and share that story.
From Morocco to Madagascar, young voices are rising in protest against corruption. In Morocco, nationwide demonstrations are taking place over failing schools and hospitals, while in Madagascar, thousands defy security crackdowns, demanding lasting fixes to power and water shortages. Demonstrations in Morocco calling for better education and healthcare have escalated into violent clashes with security forces, now in their 4th consecutive day. Crowds filled streets at least 11 cities, accusing the government of corruption and prioritizing international sporting events over basic public services. Many protesters drew a direct link between the country's fragile health system and the heavy spending ahead of the 2030 FIFA World Cup, chanting "Stadiums are here, but where are the hospitals?" The movement, led by the groups such as Gen Z 212 and Morocco Youth Voices, is being fueled online through platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and the gaming app Discord. Responding to the escalating dissent, the governing coalition issued a statement signaling openness to dialogue. It pledged to engage young people within institutions and public spaces to find realistic solutions. In Madagascar's capital,
so we've already talked about Madagascar. So, you know, back to the story of Morocco. So, as stated, right, they are focused on FIFA. And the people said, where are the hospitals, right? So what are your thoughts on the protest in Morocco and for multiple days straight on the allegations of corruption.
Yeah, and again, it would only take one or two things, that people will focus on, and then they're like, you know what, we need you to fix this entire situation, because it's not even working anymore, obviously. What I find impressive about this is that it's actually even a leaderless. There's no leader. There's no necessary, like in Nepal, you had a face. There's really no face for this. It's decentralized. And it also shows you the power of social media, because it was through social media they were able to galvanize people. TikTok, Instagram, these are people who have come together, the Gen Zs again, coordinating this protest, sharing their videos, sharing their grievances. It's a lot of chaos when it comes to their public welfare. There's some corruption in their government. And some will tell you this is actually the largest protest that Morocco has had in years. There was one in between 2016 and 2017, the Reef protest. So some people are actually making comparisons with that. So shout out to Morocco for, I guess they protest every decade, at least one protest a decade. But the main thing here is that, again, there are issues with infrastructure. There's a high corruption rate. Morocco is making all these strides, which we have addressed some of it, and it's pretty impressive as far as sports. The things they've prioritized, it's pretty impressive. But what is the point of doing all that if you have urbanites, if you have Gen Zs feeling left behind? If the unemployment rate is high, if university graduates cannot find decent work, even informal work is hard to find, what do you expect? So this economic stagnation is the backdrop for what we're seeing in Morocco. And again, power to the people.
Absolutely, power to the people. Look, I said it before, and on the last story, I guess I'll say it differently. I think it's I don't want to understate how difficult it is to go out and protest knowing there's a possibility that you can be unalived, right? I know that's a possibility here in the United States, but at the very least, I think most people feel like there are some checks and balances. When we're talking about other countries where it's not a part of the Constitution, right? And you have people doing this, they are going out there to risk their lives because they believe in this so much. What you see is a wide use of technology to communicate, which I think is really important. And I think it shows that that allows for many people to organize without having a central leader. As you mentioned, there isn't one central leader, but all these folks can prioritize and organize and figure out what they want to speak to. Yeah, I mean, look, the government of Morocco says they're willing to have dialogue. Let's see what dialogue looks like and see what change comes of it. But I like to see this this type of response because we haven't had that before. I think when you talk to people of, yesteryear, the previous generation, a lot of them just threw their hands up and said, I don't know, what can we do? It's just corrupt. Right. And I think this generation is sick and tired of it, and they're willing to go out there and actually protest it. So I'm happy to see that. I think it's really important to highlight it. And that's why we highlighted those two stories today, to make sure that you guys were aware that these protests are happening, and the young people on the continent are standing up. So those of you who are thinking about the continent and you're trying to figure out where you want to live, what causes you want to be involved in, where do you want to invest your dollars, what is the sentiment of the people on the ground, you're hearing it and seeing it, and you're noticing that there is a wide use of social media to communicate these things. So even though the continent is about 40% online, those who are online have found a way to organize. And so I think that should be a bright spot here, to look at the fact that technology is being utilized properly, and those of you who are thinking about the continent and wondering where it is in terms of its development, I think this is at least one one bright spot. People are aware, they're not giving into the propaganda and they're sharing what needs to be shared and getting out and doing something about it. Okay, so now we are running low on time. So I think what I want to do is skip to some of the stories in the headline form instead of going through any more videos. Really quickly, I do just want to call out this one story. Maybe you can give your thoughts on it before we run into some of the other African briefs. But the Netherlands and Uganda reached deals on centers for rejected asylum seekers. Outlined in a letter of intent, it will see African migrants deported from the Netherlands to a transit center in Uganda en route to their home countries. What are your thoughts on this story?
Well, I mean, it's Uganda. Uganda has chosen to be a dumping ground, respectfully. They get rejected somewhere. Uganda is, you know, happy to take them. I mean, beyond, in all seriousness, beyond the political side of things, these are the kinds of things that our leaders, the kinds of decisions our leaders choose to make actually on our behalf. You know, we don't get any say. These are decisions you make that affect the dignity of Africa as a continent. We keep having our wonderful African countries in the spotlight. You know, they're headlining news, global news, might I add, and letting people see that we are the place to bring your immigrants to. You have migrant issues, come to Africa. We'll hook you up for whatever amount of money or whatever the trade-off is. In Mahama's case, I want to quickly bring him in. In Mahama's case,
in Ghana,
as we discussed, was it last week or the last time we talked about it?
Yeah.
He said there was no economic benefit to it. But guess what? We're going to talk about that shortly. The trade-off is what? Trump has reduced some of the visa restrictions on Ghana. So there's always something. But the big question is, do you prioritize your continent, the dignity of Africa? For how much? We have all the resources. What is the issue? I don't understand these partnerships. When we do partnerships with these Western countries, we sell out our people. And this has been the story throughout our history. It's just very sad to see.
Yeah, good point. And on that note, that was the next story. So Trump has reversed the visa restrictions on Ghana last week. They can now apply for 5-year visas again, removes the controversies around immigrants from the U.S. So 2 weeks ago, we reported on the fact that Ghana accepted some migrants from third-party countries. And as you said, the story from Ghana was that it was a Pan-Africanist move. Ghana has always accepted other Africans to their country. And they also mentioned that they did not take any money from the United States in order to take these migrants. But it does look like there was a bit of a quid pro quo because these visa restrictions have been listed or have been lifted. Any additional thoughts on that since you brought it up in the previous story?
Yeah, same thing. We need our dignity restored. If you want to do your partnerships or whatever it is, don't drag the continent into it. It's not a very good look for us. And I guess Mahama felt he had to do what he had to do, but I'm not a fan of that move.
I will just say, I would like citizenship in Ghana, so I will decline to speak on this particular story. So Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger jointly announced they would withdraw from the International Criminal Court, the ICC, intensifying an ongoing dispute over sovereignty, perceived bias, and regional dynamics of justice. Any thoughts on the AES announcing that they're going to withdraw from the ICC?
Yet another move by the AES to distance itself from the West. And that's why I say, when you think about the dignity of your people, that should be priority. And that's what the AES is doing.
Yeah, I imagine that the AES will be a part of BRICS very shortly. I can't imagine that will not happen. Yeah. I would be on the lookout for that. They are removing themselves from Western blocks. I mean, the United Nations includes many countries, you know, but, you know, I do think as there is a NATO and there are other regional groups that work together on trade, I do expect to see the AES at some point joining BRICS. So stay tuned for that prediction. I do believe that will be happening. Stay tuned on that. Okay, so Bobby Wine cleared to run for president in January. You want to give a little bit of background on this and what that means?
I mean, as we know, Museveni has been in power only since 1986. So, yeah.
In Uganda, by the way.
In Uganda.
Just for those of you who aren't aware.
Yes, in Uganda. Bobby Wine is the strongest opposition to Museveni, and he's been locked up. Matter of fact, there was a documentary on his story a few years ago. He's been locked up many times. He's been, I mean, and it's not just him. Other opposition members have actually also faced this suppression. And recently, I think we did report that Bobby had been removed and was not allowed to run, as has been the rhetoric throughout Africa, unfortunately, Tanzania, you know, different countries, Cameroon. And to now lift that is wonderful. But I do hope, that it means the people's votes will actually count this time, Museveni. It's time for you to retire. I mean, it was time for you to retire long ago, but the Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, the second best time is today. Bro, take a walk. Let the people, you know, get the freedom they deserve. And this is why leaders like Idi Amin get glorified, because you have a Museveni in power. Thank you, Joe. Are you trying to get Ugandan citizenship too?
I'm not, but I have friends there, so I want to. But the people that I know there are very much in support of Bobby Wine for sure, and yes. I think many people are. He's one of those figures that have really galvanized the youth. So I hope to see that this actual, you know, chance to a real chance for him to run and win. Let's see what happens in the election in January. Malawi election. The 85-year-old is returning to the job he held until 2020 when he lost in a rerun ordered by the court. What are your thoughts about this?
So when I talk about glorifying of Idi Amin, it's things like this. I mean, in Nigeria, you have Abacha being glorified. And when Abacha was in power, people were horrified, it seemed. In this case, so what happens, what I've seen with African leadership is that people look back to the past with longing. When you have the current government in power doing way worse, it's like it gets progressively worse. An 85-year-old man being brought back, I mean, that's the people's votes have to count. And that I am excited for, because I was afraid, I don't know, I thought that some corruption would come into play, but the people's votes seem to have counted. And that is the most important thing. That's who they elected. I just hope that he's able to deliver on his promises. And hopefully we can get a younger crop of leaders going forward. But hopefully while he's in power, he's able to perform.
There it is. Yeah, I mean, look, you know, we've talked about this on a couple of occasions. We need younger leadership, period, on the continent. And not just on the continent, everywhere in the world. But the continent is what we're focused on. So that's what we're talking about. But yeah, it's obvious. It's needed. Some of these folks that have been in power for 30, 20, 40 years, you know, obviously we need new ideas and we need new leadership. And if we want to progress into the 20th century and beyond, the 21st century and beyond, we do need to have young leadership. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. So those are the stories.
I'm sorry, the youngest leader right now on the continent is Diomaye Faye, correct?
Yes, I think he's slightly younger than Ibrahim Traoré.
Are you impressed? Next story.
Age doesn't necessarily mean that we will be impressed by their leadership. Let's be clear. Yes, I mean, I will say the people of Senegal have spoken, and many of them are disappointed by the youth leadership in Senegal, and that is unfortunate. I spoke to someone yesterday I went to an event, and there are a lot of Senegalese that work in the restrooms at these clubs here in the United States, and they pass out the paper towels and stuff when you wash your hands. And I spoke to someone and asked her, and she was very disappointed with him. And you know, she's obviously living here in this country trying to make a living, but I thought it was really interesting to hear her viewpoint. So yeah, so youth does not necessarily mean new ideas. and doesn't mean that everyone is going to be excited about their ideas. I think we just need new leadership. Youth could mean new ideas, and we hope that the two do happen.
Yes.
Any other thoughts before we go?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add to that. And I'm glad, and that was why I had to say that, because I actually, you know, the Senegal conversation, you and I have had it off air, and I met a Senegalese man at the airport the other day, and I was like, man, I was supposed to have asked him how Diomaye Faye is performing, because I was rooting hard for this man. But there are two things that have happened in addition to, it's just been quite quiet when it comes to Senegal's developments and all these lofty ideas. I'm not saying they will not perform or that they're not performing. I mean, the most important thing was that the people's votes were able to count. So that in itself was a huge achievement. But two things, you know, the representation at the White House, I didn't quite like that conversation with Trump. And then recently when he had the opportunity to speak at the UN, he spoke on important issues. But again, as we discussed earlier, failed to talk about deep issues affecting our continent. So I just expected more and better from him. That's all.
And there you have it. Thanks again for an insightful discussion. Didn't have a lot of comments this time, but a lot of people were listening in. So appreciate you guys who listened all the way through. Hopefully you found this useful and helpful, and you can pass on this knowledge to other people in your lives. Please also press share and share this with people that you know so they can watch this video. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to all platforms. The Gloria AO on everything, Authentic African on everything. And make sure you stay tuned every Thursday where we tell you the news of the day on the continent. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you all on the next video.